I've always tried to learn from history because I guarantee you, and I'm sure my contemporaries have all said this, you're going to repeat it. We will be in the same kind of environment again as we screwed it up the first time, or we didn't learn enough the first time. For me, the preparation of the battle space, if you will, understanding as much as possible about the new environment. The second is understanding who else is an expert in that environment, or at least purports to be, and go find them and talk to them.
Welcome to The Science of Leadership, the podcast dedicated to helping you become a better leader. Here, you'll gain valuable knowledge, hear inspiring stories, and learn the scientific principles that promote exceptional leadership. I'm Tom Collins, your host, and I'm thrilled to have you join us on this journey to becoming a better leader. Today, I'm excited to have General Gene Renuart with us to discuss the necessity for leaders to be an expert in their battle space. General Renuart graduated from Indiana University with a degree in production and industrial management, and later earned a master's in psychology from Troy State University. In the Air Force, he served in leadership roles across multiple combat and operational theaters, including leading missions in Desert Storm and Enduring Freedom. He went on to become the commanding general of both NORAD and U.S. Northern Command. Since retiring, he serves on boards of public and private corporations, as well as philanthropic and university foundations. General, thank you for joining me today on The Science of Leadership, and thank you for your service to our nation.
Well, thanks, Tom, and it's really great to be with you, and I look forward to our conversations today for sure.
Great. Well, let's just jump right in here. You've had an extraordinary career leading at really the highest levels. That's when I think of NORAD and so forth. One thing that stands out is your emphasis on leaders understanding and mastering their battle space. And so could you share with us what that means to you?
Well, Tom, when I was a really young aviator, this was post-Vietnam, and most of my kind of leadership role models were Vietnam experienced combat veterans. And one in particular that I looked up to a lot gave me a bit of advice early on, and he said that you have to remember the most important job you have is the one you have today. And at the time, as a lieutenant, you don't think much about that. Okay, that's pretty wise and smart of him to tell me that. What does that really mean? And I come to find over the years that no matter what your level of leadership ultimately becomes, you really have to make sure that you prepare for, study for, and master the skills that make you successful in the job you have right now. If you don't do that, you're probably not going to be as successful at whatever the particular skill sets might be. Flying an airplane, leading a company, just developing a team to build briefings for the next proposal in an organization. And if you don't put the time and effort into being educated and credible and knowledgeable about those skill sets, it's not likely A, you'll succeed, and B, you may not bring a team along with you that wants to help the organization succeed. So that not focusing on 2 jobs from now, but really focusing on the job that I have today and making sure I can be the best possible person at that task is really critical. And as you progress through your careers, and given higher leadership responsibilities, that same adage applies. If you aren't credible with your team, and if you aren't able to accomplish the skills that are required of a person at your level, and oh, by the way, the expectations and skill sets of your teammates, it's hard for you to then ask them to commit themselves to something bigger than the organization, whether it's flying in combat or, again, providing better health care in a hospital facility. It doesn't matter. You have to have credibility with your team, and that's empathy. That's technical skills. It's being willing to take on the less desirable tasks when others would choose not to do that. Those are all elements of demonstrated leadership that convinces your team that you have, if you will, what it takes to be a good leader. And you can't really demand of your subordinates and your teammates something that will put them at some risk if you haven't already demonstrated that you're willing to take those same risks yourself.
Yeah, that's a really nuanced answer and full as I would come to expect from you. So I appreciate that. The idea that Battlespace, because I think for listeners, they may think when we talk about Battlespace, that Battlespace is just your physical environment. And that's not necessarily the truth. And we'll certainly get to that momentarily when we talk a little bit about Afghanistan and so forth. But this idea that it is your responsibility, whatever it is within your responsibility, your job, to do, to be a master of that. Because if you don't, you won't have the credibility to lead. And so that's I really appreciate that you bring that depth out there. Now, you've really had plenty of real world experience leading in really complex battle spaces. Do you have a good story that highlights how battle space expertise was vital to some success during your career?
Yeah, there's we could do a whole 2-hour podcast on some of those stories, but I think to capture what I tried to describe in your first question, I would go back to the time of Desert Storm, the first Iraqi invasion into Kuwait. I was a flying squadron commander in an A-10 squadron at the time, and when I took that job a couple years before that, you sort of have two paths. You can become a manager of a large organization, or you can become the leader of the organization. And it was always my view that I should be held to the same highest standards that I hold to my most experienced leaders who would then potentially be asked to go into combat. And so becoming a flight leader or an instructor pilot or a combat search and rescue lead, those are, in that community, are skill sets that are held to only a few, but also held in very high regard amongst the members of your squadron, your organization. And it was important to me that I demanded the study and the preparation to accomplish those roles, and spent the time to make that work. And I did that. And then as we saw Desert Shield and then Desert Storm unfolding, we're taking our squadron into combat for the very first time. No one in our unit had any combat experience up to that point. You know, I was the oldest, if you will, and I came in post-Vietnam. It was a very new experience that we were all going to be exposed to. My other philosophy was we wanted to have our youngest, least experienced pilots flying as wingmen with our most experienced leaders. And so I had a young lieutenant who was my wingman, who literally only had about 350 hours in the airplane, had come out of training and come right to us. And 3 months later, we're headed off to Saudi Arabia. And he asked me the night before our first combat mission, you know, boss, what's this going to be like? And Eric Miller was his name. And I said, Eric, look, first of all, this is going to be discovery learning for both of us. You know, we don't know exactly how it will feel because we've not had that experience. But I can tell you that we've trained extraordinarily hard. The quality of our training has been exceptional. We trust each other in a high demand environment, and our training will kick in. Our if you will, expertise will kick in when stress builds up. So stay with me. We're going to be good, and that'll get us through our first mission and then missions and beyond. And it did that. What that impressed, I hope, on that young man, but also reinforced for me, is that if you're not fully comfortable with the training, the experience, the practice, and if you don't make yourself practice those skill sets in a substantial way, then you're starting out a little bit behind the power curve. Well, as time went on, I moved on from squadron command to wing command. Our unit in Germany deployed into both Kosovo region and then later on into the Middle East, and I still continued to fly as much as I can as a flight lead, even though I was a colonel and a brigadier general, because I felt it was important to demonstrate to the one, maybe to myself, that I could still do that, keep up with the young bucks, but more importantly, to demonstrate to the team that, hey, the boss is willing to come out here and put himself in the same situations we're in. We must be okay. We must be doing the right things. We must be getting the right kind of training. And so that really put me in a great position as later on a 2-star, again, still flying combat support missions in Iraq during the pre-9/11 days, to understand the region, the Middle East, etc. And as sort of circumstances unfolded there, became the director of operations at U.S. Central Command about 4 months before 9/11. And so I had extensive experience in the region. I had a good working relationship with leaders in the region, but I also understood what we were asking our young men and women to do, by the way, to include my own son. And that helped to shape the way I approached the planning and the integration of forces and the value of coalitions as we began the operations post 9/11 in Afghanistan and then later on in Iraq.
Well, as I was thinking about our conversation, this idea of battle space, and you were just hitting on this to some degree, but there's so much psychology, because you were talking about really the psychology of the younger pilots and your team, and within that there are always politics and different things. And so understanding all of that landscape, not to mention the actual landscape in which you're flying and the airframe that you're flying and all that goes into that. There was something that we discussed a little bit when I interviewed you previously for my study. You were talking about the negative impacts that occurred because we, as a nation, didn't really understand the battle space historically and culturally that was or is Afghanistan. And so I was wondering if you could discuss that a little bit, because I think it's really an important side conversation that really fills out this idea of battle space.
Sure, happy to. And you mentioned in the introduction that my master's degree is in psychology, and people often ask, why did you do that? And a little bit of serendipity. I was a young instructor pilot, and at that time, the Air Force said, we want all our officers to get a master's degree. And so, as often happens, you find the program that's close by. And I was a young dad with a newborn and going to school and flying and doing all that at the same time. And so I pursued that degree in psychology, not knowing that I probably would use those tools more in my career than anything in production and industrial management. Certainly I could look at technical problems and figure out ways to solve those things, but the psychology of your team, the psychology of your environment, the psychology of region of the world that you're about to become engaged in, it's art form. It's not, yes, there is a science, but really it is how you deal with the leadership, the personal issues. Back to my Desert Storm days, between my wife and I, we knew every family story of our 100 people that were deployed with us. Why? Because, we're going to be 15,000 miles away or 12,000 miles away. And we needed to know that a pilot was going to be affected by the fact that his baby's sick at home, and we have no good communications. There's no cell phone. So I know I'm diverging a little bit, but really to say that understanding your people and how they view issues became really valuable later on down the road as we got through 9/11 and began looking at a part of the world that we really had ignored. In fact, we had almost pushed aside as being irrelevant to us. When the Russians left Afghanistan in 1989, the West pretty much said, well, neither Afghanistan nor Pakistan are of any strategic interest to us, so we're going to leave it alone. And I may have said to you once before that think of what might have been different had we and the West put a couple $1 billion worth of aid in there versus just walking away. Important, though, when you walk away, you lose context and content with the history of the people, with the tribal elements that are very real. We didn't understand from a historical context how dividing lines were drawn in a country where we essentially split families from one side of the border in Afghanistan to the other side in Pakistan. And that'll come up later in Iraq. We had really no language speakers for the major languages of Afghanistan. We had almost zero expertise in our State Department and in our Defense Department in that region of the world. We didn't drive our so-called foreign area officers to be experts in that region. We had a very small group of them. So when now, I'll say all of a sudden, we find that a major threat to the U.S. is hosted in a country that we've ignored for, at that point, 15 or 20 years, we're left trying to decide on major issues without the historical context and the political context of where that country is. I mean, if you go back in history, Afghanistan has a proud history as a trading nation. They had great universities. They were well educated, and over a series of a couple decades, they were diminished to a country that had extensive poverty. On 9/11, 50% of Afghanistan was being fed by aid organizations of varying types, AIR and USAID and many others. They had been oppressed by the Taliban, who had been in partnership with the Russians and had been basically taking money from all aspects of the country. You had really 3 ethnic groups in the north and a 4th in the south, very strong tribal leadership, but identities there. We didn't understand the Tajik strength, if you will, the Kazakh and Tajik relationships weren't necessarily partners, yet they controlled each of them a major portion of the country. And we thought we could overlay on that an American solution. And, oh, by the way, we had no working relationships with any of the countries in the region. So it didn't matter. Pakistan, you might recall, we were holding up a sale of F-16s for about a decade to them. And they were not happy with us. But we needed access through their airspace to be able to get into Afghanistan. We really had no long-standing relationship with Tajikistan or Uzbekistan, and yet, Uzbek and Tajik leaders were critical to how we were going to unfold this plan. So we were trying to do our best at building a plan that could be executed without understanding or having access to the political nuances that really were Afghanistan as a nation. That really put us in a difficult position, and we didn't really know that as we were beginning this operation, because we didn't know the depth of the divisions amongst the tribal factions. We didn't know the political dynamic that was the Taliban and how much they had oppressed the people. We had a sense, but not really. So that really created some challenges. And I'll go back to my comment about half the Afghans were being fed by international organizations. That also affected how you create your battle plan, because those aid organizations have warehouses all over the country. Big food warehouses look a lot like big military warehouses.
Yeah.
They move over roads and bridges throughout the country. Traditional air power doctrine says you make all those go away. Well,
Right.
you can't really do that and now not allow the aid to get out. So that actually caused friction within our own coalition. And then you add on to that some 55 or 60 coalition partners who have all stood up to say we want to support the U.S. and the free world in this post 9/11 environment, this war on terror, if you will. And each of them come with their own view of the region, their view of the world politic, their view of national restrictions that they would have to put in place in order to contribute forces or equipment or what have you, or money. And if you didn't have a good understanding of all of those nuances, you talked about a nuanced approach before. This one was extraordinary in that we had a mini UN within our compound at Tampa, plus all of the national agencies, and you had to knit together a strategy and a plan that could be executed while acknowledging each of those concerns. And so, if you didn't, we had our own internal battle space, and we had the external battle space, and you had to try to understand as well as you could each of those in order to be effective and successful. And I think the final challenge of all that is we were not given permission to move our headquarters forward from Tampa into the region until much later in the operations. And so we're conducting command and control from 12,000 miles away, and 7 time zones or 12 time zones or whatever the number was. And that adds its own battle space stress to the environment. So it posed some challenges that we really had not ever had to deal with in the past. And so lesson learned out of that, and what we see today is we are putting in place education programs, strategy programs that deal with that uncertainty. And you're never going to know everything for sure, but if we don't prepare our young leaders to operate in those kinds of geographic environments, we basically tie one hand behind their back before we send them in. A little bit like those 12 special forces guys that we flew into Afghanistan, and we've all seen the movie, but they land in the middle of the night. They have no clue who they're going to meet. They have no clue if they're going to be shot or supported. And yet we asked those young leaders and those young special forces troops to figure it out. And they do, but we probably could have been better at helping them on the front end of that to have a better sense from intelligence and almost psychological reconnaissance that can teach them the things that they might experience and ought to know before entering in.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. I think it hopefully gives our listeners some idea of at least a little bit of the complexities that go with something like this. And we're talking generally about leadership and battle space, but that is, as you say, it's hard to imagine one that is significantly more nuanced and complex than that, and the unknown unknowns that were there, and the degree to which that impacted our operations, the time that we remained in Afghanistan, all that goes into that thereafter. One thing that I was thinking of as you were sharing that was this idea of when someone assumes a leadership position in an organization. Let's say they're brought in from outside. There are kind of two approaches. One is come in and I'm the boss and I'm going to change everything and all that sort of thing. And that rarely goes very well. And the other is don't do anything for X period of time. Now that may be 6 months or a year or whatever it may be. But I think that is so much the wiser, because it is taking the time to figure out what is the culture, what is the language, whatever that language, because every organization's got its own language and jargon and politics and culture and psychology and all those things. Figure that out and then start to make changes and moving, because I think you can be so much more effective that way. And anyway, so I was thinking about that in a non-military context.
If I could just add on a postscript to that, Tom, I think you're making a great point. And you stole a little of my thunder from Secretary Rumsfeld. The unknown unknowns. I'll come back to it maybe in a minute. But we can't know everything. And so the other part of this art form is, and it kind of goes to your example of coming into a new organization, is the least successful leaders are the bull in the china shop leaders. Let's break it all, and then I'll fix it. Well, along the way, you leave casualties no matter what, whether it's physical or human or whatever. I think that you have to spend an important amount of time in the areas that you know least about. I call it go where you're least comfortable, and listen. After I retired, I was asked to chair the board of a 600-bed hospital in Colorado, and then later served on the board of the University of Colorado Health System, which at that time had 9 hospitals. And for an Air Force fighter pilot, there was a lot that I knew nothing of, but I tried to spread myself across the organization to understand the challenges of being a physician in an OR with a very complicated procedure, or being a nursing assistant taking care of elderly patients who are fall risks and who you have to kind of keep watch on every day. And what I learned from that is that, just like in Afghanistan, it's a complex world. Healthcare is not simple. You won't know everything there is to know. So you can't hold off forever before putting your thumbprint. At least in the military, you kind of 2 years is sort of your
right.
So you're going to move on. But even if you look across industry, leaders tend to move routinely. Maybe not every 2 years, but certainly 3, 4, 5 years. It's rare today to see leaders that kind of stay within an organization in the same position for 25 years. Mm-hmm. So you have to sort of find that balance that is, I think I've observed enough and I've learned enough that this really works well, and that doesn't seem to work as well. I'm not going to micromanage the things that work really well, but let me pay attention and find a couple experts to help me with the things that are not working so well. Mm-hmm. And I learned a ton about healthcare by doing that. And it, you will ruffle feathers in those processes. There's no doubt. But if you don't ask the hard questions, I don't mean to say demand like being, forcefully demanding, but really insist on detailed answers that can tell you why either your opinion or your observation is right or wrong, then you won't get to good solutions. And so the same was true certainly then in Afghanistan. And by the way, we were way from perfect there because we didn't know what we didn't know. And I think the same is true in business or in healthcare or in education today.
Well, thanks for that postscript. Very valuable, and bringing in the healthcare side and so forth. That's good for our listeners to know that, you weren't, quote, just a 4-star general who was responsible for, if I remember Laurie Robinson's number correctly, 52% of the airspace of the globe, but also, you've been involved in the healthcare arena as well as other spaces, and so that's helpful. I usually try to share a way that I've screwed this idea up in my career so that folks can see what it looks like, and also to demonstrate to folks that I think leaders make mistakes and we can learn from them and get better. But think about this idea of battle space, and I was rolling that around, and whether physically, as we talked about, psychologically that we've hit on, emotionally, or some other way, I think is vitally important. That's the whole reason we're doing an episode on it. It can be hard, just as you've hit on, but I had this event a few years ago. And so I'd been recruited to a different institution. I had spent a period of my career at this one institution, was recruited away. And so I have this weird character trait that I really care about the institutions that I've been at previously. I always want them to continue to do great things and do well. And so I'm always thinking, about those and how can they do well as the place where I am. But I still care about those prior places because I think they're important to who I am now and the opportunities I've had. So I still cared very much about this prior institution and the people there and the cardiology program I'd left, and I wanted them to succeed and all. And so I was getting all these inputs from people there, whether it be junior faculty, trainees, some faculty in other parts of the hospital who weren't cardiology and so forth. There were things that were going on that were problems and concerns. And so I decided, as I usually do, if I have something really important to say, I write it. And so I decided I would write this letter to the division chief there, sharing these things I'd been hearing, and I didn't name any people. Obviously, that wouldn't be a good move, but offering some ways that I gave it a lot of thought, ways that I thought some of these issues could be addressed. And I wrote this letter, and it was pages. I mean, it was, I think, 8 pages, if I remember right. Long, and it took me a long time to compose because I really wanted to do it all justice, and I wanted it to be said appropriately in a way that I'd try my best not to be threatening. So, and the division chief there was somebody I had spent years working with, somebody I considered to be a friend, and thought he would receive this letter, my thoughts in it in a really good manner, in the manner I intended it, like trying to be helpful, trying to help the program because I still cared, right? And so I went to the trouble of vetting it with multiple people to say, hey, how would you receive this? Do you think this would be good? And the majority, there were a couple people who were like, I don't know, this is probably not the greatest idea, but most of the people said, hey, this is really good. This is valuable. I think that you should send it. And so turns out those 2 people who said you shouldn't send it, they were right. I was totally wrong, and the other folks were wrong. I overestimated the state of our relationship. I overestimated the division chief's ability to receive my well-meaning letter in a non-personal way. And as far as I can tell, it really has irreparably damaged our relationship. And that's all because I didn't understand the battle space. And the battle space in that moment really was relationship, was psychology, was how this division chief was perceiving his role and how he's performing in it, and the fact that other people are talking to me instead of him, and all these sorts of things. And that really cost me a lot then, and to this day is still a major thing. So I didn't understand my battle space in that regard, and so total failure.
Well, I'd like to say, no, I've never experienced that, but trust me, we've all gone through those kinds of circumstances. And on the one hand, the military has this sort of unwritten, I guess, rule that you hand the flag to a new guy and you walk away. And as much as you say, hey, if you ever need anything, please call me. I'm happy to help out in any way. The new guy coming in or new gal coming in says, thank you very much. I'm never talking to you again, because they're the new leader. And it's a bit like, passing the flag on the battlefield. The king is dead, long live the king. And a new king picks up the flag and off you go. And so that's sort of the history and tradition of the military. However, I'm not nearly that smart. And so I tried to not routinely, but when I ran up against something that I hadn't seen before or that I was concerning to me, I probably called my predecessor 3 or 4 times, because he understood the history of a relationship with somebody in government or somebody within a state or the National Guard or the service. And I always found it valuable to ask that question. Now, if he had called me and said, hey, dude, you need to fix this, I might have reacted the same way as your former friend, because you feel like, okay, give me a little space to have my own room. In fact, I had a former boss when I took command of my fighter squadron that he stayed close by and said, "Hey, what are you doing?" I go, "This is now my squadron. I won't do everything the same way you did. I loved the way we were going, and I'll keep a lot of that, but I'm going to have my own touch on this." And there's a balance there for sure. But one of the things I've learned with that is when you get some of those rumbling feedbacks, my first question is always, have you gone to your supervisor, your boss, your division chief, and expressed your concern? Because they're the leader now, and you owe it to them to go to them with your concern. And usually at the other end of the phone was silence. Because it's much easier to come to you or to me and say, "Dang, the new guy, yada, 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 yada." And when they realize that they have a responsibility to take those issues, if you will, up the chain of command so that you give the new boss, the new commander, the opportunity to A, understand them because they may not understand them, and B, fix them. And then if they don't, you have another set of discussions to have about, is this the right place for me under this leadership, et cetera, et cetera. So, we've all been there, trust me. And after the first few scars, you begin to figure out maybe there's a little bit better way for me to approach things like that, for sure.
Yeah. Thinking about our topic, this idea of being an expert in your battle space, really knowing the environment in which you're operating. We've touched on it a little bit as far as why it's important. What would you say is the crux of this, of why it's so important to be really an expert in our battle space?
I think we will continue as leaders to be, if you're a good leader, you're going to be asked to lead more complex environments, in more complex environments. And if you're going to succeed in that, and by the way, those will be in areas that you probably know less and less about the farther you progress in your career. And so if you're going to be successful in that, you have to understand that you have lots of learning to do as you're in the current job, back to my comment about being the best you can be in today's job. And as you have the potential to move on, there's a lot of homework to be done with what that new environment looks like. People ask me what's in your library, and I'm looking over at my library, and the one common piece in every one of those books is leadership. And it's not the science of leadership per se. It's what happened at the Battle of the Bulge, what happened in the Civil War in Manassas or at Gettysburg, and what happened in Vietnam, and how did leaders evolve? Even in things like Harry Potter, there are exercises in leadership and right and wrong and good and evil that have a bearing on how you think about challenging problems. And so I've always tried to learn from history, because I guarantee you, and I'm sure my contemporaries have all said this, you're going to repeat it. We will be in the same kind of environment again as we screwed it up the first time, or we didn't learn enough the first time. And so for me, the preparation of the battle space, if you will, involves understanding as best you can, and we only have limited number of hours in the day and days in the week, et cetera, to do that study, but as best you can, understanding as much as possible about the new environment. The second is understanding who else is an expert in that environment, or at least purports to be, and go find them and talk to them. And that was a lesson that we didn't learn in Afghanistan, and we didn't learn in Iraq. We didn't understand the historical context of the country we're about to break. Now, I will say that we didn't have time to do a lot of that, because 9/11 happened kind of out of the blue, if you will, and the National Command Authority wanted the potential to respond within hours, not days or weeks or months. And so, and even once we changed the approach to a ground-centric operation with support from the air that was decisive, that was still on a timeline that was way shorter than taking a 3-hour history course on Afghanistan and Pakistan. And we didn't have the experts out there that really knew that. So you can't do it in every case, but as much as you can, try to seek out those people with some historical background in the area that you're about to undertake, and pick their brain. You won't agree with everything they say. That's okay. Pick their brain, understand their perspective. And then the other is, as we view a problem, and I'll put this in the military diplomatic environment, try not to view a problem in U.S. eyes, with U.S. eyes, but try to understand if this is going to be a coalition operation or a multinational corporation operation. Try to understand the problem from the eyes of the coalition members. Again, you won't, in fact, you may not, with the U.S. as a leader in things like these operations, we probably can't take everybody's view into account, but you at least know what their view is. And they feel like their view was taken into consideration. If you don't do that, then you start to have this, chattering in the margins that can be disruptive and destructive potentially to whatever you're trying to accomplish. So that dynamic is true for small organizations or multinational, combat operations across thousands of miles of battle space. So I think spending time preparing your own mind for that battle space before you enter as much as you possibly can. And then understanding that there's still going to be things you don't know. And I'll come back to that maybe as we close up today. But I think we sometimes have the view that we have the solution and don't realize that it's a solution.
Well, thanks for sharing those points. You're correct. It turns out 86% of the 4 stars that I interviewed for my study talked about this idea of being an expert, knowing your battle space, and so forth. And so this really drives home, this critical leadership principle, if we want to call it that, of being an expert in your environment or battle space we've been talking about. And if we talk about the science of it, it actually does, as you might imagine, dramatically improve our effectiveness. There have been a number of studies over the last century, and they've shown that understanding your environment is, this idea of situational awareness a lot of people talk about. And that has a number of positive effects. There was work by Gary Klein that showed it improves our decision-making in high-stress environments, aids in problem solving. Others have shown it improves our communication among team members, which obviously makes sense if we're speaking the same language. We got to know the language of our space. That when we speak the same language and we got better communication, then we have better team performance. And also knowing our battle space helps mitigate risks and prevent accidents. Additionally, as I mentioned, this idea of communication, it fosters that. So on a number of fronts, knowing our battle space, being an expert in what we're doing, really improves our ability to lead effectively. For our listeners who might be leading environments different from the military operations, again, you talked about being involved in hospital boards. Maybe they're running a hospital or a business, or maybe they're a leader in a school. And you named some and the practical steps that they can take to become really an expert in their battle space. What practical tips would you give them?
Probably the first is be humble enough to know that you don't know everything. No matter what position you're being hired into. I want you to lead a major defense contractor, and you've led 3 others before, doesn't mean you know everything about that defense contractor or that manufacturing corporation. So be humble enough to know that you don't know everything there is to know. Be smart enough to realize that you have to learn as you start. So back to our discussion about don't come charging in. There may be some businesses out there that are losing bazillions of dollars, and they need a little bit of a hefty nudge to get them turned around. But even in those circumstances, there are things you don't know about the chemistry of that organization. And so you have to take time to understand that to some degree and learn from that. And I talked about sort of go out and visit the things you know least about. I mean, I can remember walking out on the flight line at 3 a.m. and a young airman's underneath an F-16 trying to fix a hydraulic problem. And I walk up and crouch down next to him and hopefully didn't startle him too bad, to say, hey, how's it going? Tell me what you're working on. And not only did he tell me what he's working on, but I also learned about his family and where he's from and why he's here in this place in Germany and what does he think about that. And the benefit of that kind of experience is that you learn way more than you thought you needed to know. And those are valuable tools for you to take down the road. I mentioned the hospital example. I also spent some time after we retired with a major defense contractor. And one of the interesting things to me is the significant difference in the way industry views their most critical resource, and that's their people, and the way the military uses them. And I was to some degree a little disappointed that they're making decisions based on a shareholder return, a bottom line, a dollar number, and not necessarily viewing their most critical resource, which is their people, in the same way as I was used to in the military. You got the job done with your human resource. And so you better take really good care of it. And that's not to say that all of these companies are not really doing a great job now of taking care of people the best they can. But ultimately, when they're making hard decisions, it's not based on what's the impact of this, closing down 1,000 jobs in this location or that location.
Yeah.
You may still have to do it, but at least you have to understand and prepare for the hardship that you're about to impose on some fair percentage of your corporate team or your manufacturing team. And how you take care of those people resonates across the rest of the organization. So if they see you've cut off this place and you've given basically no heads up, no warning, no separation, hey, we're glad to have you, but you're out on your own. And that sounds harsh, but it happens. Then the rest of the organization is going, well, wait a minute, what about me? How are they going to take care of me? And, I survived that, but will I survive the next? And we don't really teach that in our business schools the way I think we maybe ought to. Hope we're starting to teach more of that leadership skill to executives postgraduate, which I think is helpful and valuable. But we really don't incorporate that in any school, public policy, international relations, business, you name it. And we certainly need to. And so those are a couple things. The other, I serve on a major university's foundation board, and I serve as an advisor to their School of Global and International Studies. The academic space is a whole different environment.
It is indeed.
I think that we've seen some of the turmoil at universities over the last couple years with respect to what I view as university, I'll say leaders who've never been trained to be a leader. And we don't ask an academic to learn and demonstrate their leadership. We ask them to demonstrate their academic skill.
Right.
But, if you're running a university of 50 or 70 or 90,000 students, that's a major theater of combat operations.
Yeah.
You need to lead. You need to understand how to be a leader before you ever walk in that door. And I don't think we ask that of many of our academic institutions around the country.
Being on the inside of academics, I can say definitively we do not.
And so shame on us. Academic institutions are wonderful, and they need to have the freedom of expression that makes this country great. They are also a multi-billion-dollar business. And so you need to have leaders who have grown up understanding that there's cause and effect at every level. And so, we can hope to have 73 different academic programs in my school, but if 50 of them have student enrollments that support the cost and 20 of them don't, you have to make some hard decisions at some point. And you can't be the leader of everything. You can and should be the leader of the things that you can make the biggest impact. And so I think those kinds of approaches are valid in the military, they're valid in healthcare, they're valid in business, they're valid in education.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to prepare those young leaders with the tools that can make them successful when they go out into the real world. Because ultimately, even if they decide to start their own small coffee shop business, they've got to figure out how to solve things like, how do I pay my employees, and how do I budget my costs, and how do I take care of people when they can't make it to work, and what kind of healthcare should I have, and all those things that are the complications of life. And sometimes it seems our young people don't get that experience in any way before they're put in that situation.
Thinking about the practical things and trying to think of what are the tips that we could leave listeners with. You mentioned some earlier, and I put together a little list that I'll share. But you mentioned knowing your battle space. Do your best to study and learn it so that you become an expert as much as you can within yourself in the battle space. Ask for help. Those people who are there, who know or who have been there, ask for help from them. Understand the culture of the space that you're in. Really focus on that. Get in amongst that. And then the fourth one that you shared a little bit earlier was recognize that you're not going to know everything, and that you still have to lead despite that, and do your best within that. So I thought those were great. And there were a number of other things that I think that I would share that we can do to be sort of leaders, experts in our battle space. The first is not only studying to get ready for it, but being continuously studious, really just being a continual learning mindset about the battle space and regularly assessing it. Study from the standpoint of scholarly in a sense, but then study it as an entity. And I would say that's something that Admiral Pat Walsh referred to as scan, don't stare, which you'll know from aviation. We need to develop relationships with others who can give us their perspective. You hit on that. And you hit on be open to their feedback. I think that's a problem that so often we have a problem with is I'm the leader. I don't need to hear anybody else's feedback. Woe unto thee if that's the way you operate,
Yeah.
Know the people, the process, and the resources inside and out. Part of that's going to be where the action is. What we might say in the military is go to the front line. You did that. 3 a.m. flight line. This guy's up underneath an F-16. You pop up with brass on your shoulder. Hey, what's going on? And the final way that we can work to be an expert is to keep an eye on our competitors and others in our environment. Understand what they're up to, what their goals are. And one thing that I think that our egos can get in the way sometimes is we come up with this great idea. We look around and nobody else, none of our competitors is doing it. And we think we're just so much smarter than they are. Or is it possible they came up with the idea a long time ago, maybe tried it, or at least explored it, discovered it was a total bust, and didn't invest in it? So, the idea that maybe we're not as smart as we think we are, the absence of something, that gets back to Lieutenant General Hal Moore's sort of thing. What's going on that shouldn't be, and what is not going on that should be, right? And so it's a little bit of that thinking too. But anyway, those are some things that I put together as far as a list for our listeners. Anything, General Renuart, that we should touch on before we wrap up today's episode?
I think you hit on a couple things right there. First of all, I was happy to see you mention Pat Walsh. I think he's a great American. Known him since he was a young captain commanding an aircraft carrier in a battle group. So, and pretty fair aviator as well. So, the scan, don't stare is something that I think all of us in that world have had beat into us over many years by smart people. I think that, and Hal Moore's comment is really along the same lines. And it goes to something that I have a copy of that I keep back in my reading file. And that's, there's a lot of opinions about Secretary Don Rumsfeld, but Don Rumsfeld rules are kind of an aggregate of observations that he's made and experienced over his career. And there's a ton of them. And Those of us that have had the opportunity to work directly for him probably all have a copy in our archives somewhere. But one of the things that he and we talked about unknown unknowns through the course of the conversation. He always challenged you to think about what you don't know. What is it that I'm not thinking about? What is it that someone else has control of that I ought to know about? If you're not constantly challenging yourself with those questions, you're going to overlook something that will be significant later on down the road. The other thing that Rumsfeld left with me that I really think is valuable is we'd go in and give him a briefing on our plan, and during the build up for Afghanistan and then Iraq, we spent many hours giving him briefings on our plans, and he would spend a short period of time telling us that was either right or wrong. But importantly, he said, "Have you asked all the what if questions to your plan?" And I kind of scratch my head and say, "Sir, what do you mean what if questions?" He goes, "Okay, well, you're making an assumption that we're going to get a division's worth of ships into the Gulf before we begin operations. What if the weather's bad? What if the ships break? What if what if the country doesn't allow us to dock? Have you thought through all of those things?" And usually the answer was some of them, and or it could be, "Well, Mr. Secretary, that the State Department is working on that." Well, this is the Defense Department, and I'm in charge of it. And so what are you doing to ensure State Department is taking care of our requirement? It forced me to realize that you almost need a separate think tank to ask the what if questions. What don't we know? And how do we go about getting that? And how do we get it in a way that's meaningful to whatever it is we're planning and executing? And again, that's true in business, in education, in defense, you name it. I think that understanding the thousands of possible inputs to the decision you're about to make, you won't get them all right, but at least you've thought through a what if or 2 or 5 or 10 to make sure that when you present this or you start down a pathway, you're not going to get surprised by the most obvious what ifs and you hadn't thought about them. And so for me, those were really helpful words that I'd learned with some scar tissue as I briefed the Secretary on many occasions. And I think I've mentioned this to you before, but when I went to work for Secretary Rumsfeld and later on Secretary Gates, I asked them both for this with the same question for the one bit of leniency they would give me, and that was, I need a but sir moment every day. And to me, that was at the end of the day, your boss, your leader, whomever's in charge of making these major decisions. Oh, by the way, and you later on down the road, will probably give out some guidance that somebody really important didn't understand. And so I needed the ability to walk in at the end of the day to the secretary and say, "Mr. Secretary, I've got one but sir for you, or 2 or 3. And well, what are those?" And I'd explain that this briefing or that briefing came and went, but afterwards it was clear to me that briefer, whether it was a colonel or a general, didn't quite get your guidance clear. And before they start down a pathway that's going to get crossways with what I think your guidance is, let me read this back to you and make sure that's what you intended. And then I'll circle back with them to make sure they know that's what you intended. And so later on in life, as I had more and more of my own responsibilities, I always had a smart Navy captain or Air Force colonel or brigadier who had that flexibility to come in at the end of the day and say, "Yeah, I'm not sure this was totally clear. Let's make sure we got this right, boss." And that's a really helpful tool because it's, in any military, you're going to read back your commander's intent. And if you don't get that right, you are going to, at worst case, kill a bunch of people you don't need to. And in best case, you're going to waste some resources that you probably didn't need to either. So getting that clarification of intent is really, really important. And you shouldn't go weeks or months without getting that clarification, because you're going to be spinning your wheels and using a lot of energy that's not productive to where you want to go.
Yes, sir. Thanks for adding that postscript, and Rumsfeld's rules. Uh, I think I have a book called that, so it's good. I
It's
recommend
worth
it to
going back
folks.
to
And
over and over again.
yeah, well, General Renuart, you really challenged us today to be experts in our environment, and I really appreciate you being on. Thanks for being on the Science Leadership with me. As before, it's been a great conversation, sir.
Well, my pleasure, Tom, and reach out anytime. Best of luck as podcasts go forward.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of The Science of Leadership. We hope today's discussion has inspired you and given you valuable insights to help you become a better leader. Remember, leadership is about helping those we lead do great things. It's a journey of continual growth and learning. When we embrace that journey with curiosity, courage, and humility, we can confront challenges, overcome barriers, and foster environments where everyone can succeed. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow or subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with others who are passionate about leadership. Until next week, keep leading with character, competence, caring, and communication. This is Tom Collins. Let's keep growing.
I come to find over the years that no matter what your level of leadership ultimately becomes, you really have to make sure that you prepare for, study for, and master the skills that make you successful in the job you have right now. If you don't do that, you're probably not going to be as successful at whatever the particular skill sets might be. Flying an airplane, leading a company, just developing a team to build briefings for the next proposal in an organization. And if you don't put the time and effort into being educated and credible and knowledgeable about those skill sets, it's not likely A, you'll succeed, and B, you may not bring a team along with you that wants to help the organization succeed. So If you aren't credible with your team, and if you aren't able to accomplish the skills that are required of a person at your level, and oh, by the way, the expectations and skill sets of your teammates, it's hard for you to then ask them to commit themselves to something bigger than the organization, whether it's flying in combat or, again, providing better health care in a hospital facility. It doesn't matter. You have to have credibility with your team, and that's empathy, that's technical skills. It's being willing to take on the less desirable tasks when others would choose not to do that. Those are all elements of demonstrated leadership that convinces your team that you have, if you will, what it takes to be a good leader.